My name is John Mayo. I'm a professor of economics, business, and public policy at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business, and I'm also the executive director of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, which is our host organization today. This is an event that falls clearly in our wheelhouse. The goal of the center is to examine issues that lie at the nexus of business and public policy. Today, it happens to be that trade and the future of trade and trade agreements is absolutely at the top of the agenda for things to think about for the next administration and for the future. So it is a terrific honor that we've been able to assemble this great group of scholars and practitioners at this particular moment in the immediate wake of the election to be able to have this discussion. I'm going to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Bob Vastine, who will direct the rest of the day. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, John. I have to point out to the panelists that these mics you don't turn them on and off. They are voice activated, except for the one that you have, Dan, which has a button.
I pushed it.
And he's pushed it. We may have to re-push it, who knows. First, I'd like to start by thanking Congressman Bradley Byrne and his assistant, Mitch Ralph, for providing the forum today. We found that the place. If you don't have a place, you don't have a program. And on Capitol Hill, getting a place is a very big deal. And we've been very fortunate to have had some really important assistance from staff members of the House and the Senate. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing the panelists. You all have bio statements, so I'm not going to go into detail. I'll begin with a very good friend whom I first met, Wendy Cutler, whom I first met in 1996 at WTO negotiations on the financial services. It was part of the built-in agenda of the WTO, and we met in Geneva with business associates, business representatives of the global financial community about eight times in a row as that negotiation came to a successful conclusion thanks to Wendy and her Treasury colleague. She has been absolutely instrumental to every trade agreement, and especially to the TPP. She is a pro, and it's really great that she's been recognized with a new job as Vice President, relatively new, as Vice President and Managing Director of the Washington office of the Asia Society. So it's the Asia Society Policy Institute, I want to be correct, and has carried on from there, building a Washington office and a Washington presence. Then I'd like to introduce Dan Griswold. He is the Mercatus Center Senior Research Fellow and co-director of the Mercatus Program on the American Economy and Globalization, has a very distinguished reputation, having been at Cato and other important institutions here in the city. Brad Jensen is my co-conspirator and colleague in organizing these events, which now I think we've been doing for about 4 years, amazingly. He is the chair, the McCrane Shaker Chair in International Business at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. And he holds a number of other important positions, which I won't try to, which you can look at on your bios. Then Doug Palmer is also a buddy in a way. We go back at least to the 2008 WTO Ministerial in Geneva, where he got me in terrible trouble by reporting something that I said, I thought in confidence. Later, later the U.S. Ambassador for Trade took me aside and poked me in the stomach and the chest and said, "Never say that kind of thing again. Don't you dare try to say what you think the U.S. government is going to do." So I learned an important lesson. Thank you, Doug. And so where to go from here? I'd like to begin by asking my colleague Brad to begin with comments on the factual basis of this discussion. What is the importance of trade to this economy and the global economy, maybe? How important is it to our economic well-being? Then I'd like to ask Dan to pick up on the employment issues. What portion of unemployment is due to trade competition actually? Yeah. And then I'll ask Doug to comment. We don't have to do it necessarily in this order, but comment, if you will, on the public perception of trade as harmful to the economy. The Obama theme, why won't people listen to the facts, as the president said in a recent address. One set of people, opinion leaders mainly, believe trade to be good. Another has a different view. What's going on? Why can't we communicate better the facts? So I think we'll begin with Brad, if he's ready.
Okay.
I know he's ready.
Thanks, Bob. So looking at the campaign and the rhetoric, one would have the impression that globalization has had an enormous impact on the U.S. economy. And I think if you listen to the rhetoric, you would conclude that that impact has been largely negative. And I guess as a card-carrying economist, I'm here to try to refute that notion that globalization has been bad for the United States. In the few minutes to tee this up, I won't be able to make the full case, but I'll just try to give some context for our discussion. So how important is trade to the U.S. economy? Well, it's pretty important, but not as important as it is to lots of other economies. If you go back 50 years to the 60s, which is where a lot of people seem to have developed their notion about what the U.S. economy does look like, or at least should look like, trade share of GDP was about 10%. Relatively low by global standards. Now, trade share of GDP is about 30%. So it's grown considerably over the last 50 years. However, compared to other countries, so for example, globally, world trade share is 60% of world GDP. So the U.S. is still a fairly, I don't want to say closed economy, but it's an economy that is not as internationally engaged as many other smaller economies. We're big, so we do a lot for ourselves. So trade share has grown, and as trade has grown, it has certainly benefited the U.S. economy. That to estimate how much better off we are is a very difficult thing to do. The academic literature suggests that we're 3 to 5% better off per year, so 3 to 5% of GDP. Colleagues of mine at the Peterson Institute have come up with larger estimates, roughly 7% of GDP, which is about $1 trillion in GDP a year, that is due to the benefits of liberalization of trade over the past 50 years. That's a big number. That's a lot of benefit. Where does that come from? What is the source of that benefit? I think it comes from increased variety of goods, new goods, different goods. Households can consume more as a result of trade, consume different varieties. Businesses, we tend to think of trade as final goods, so shirts and shoes and consumer electronics. But capital goods and intermediate inputs that businesses use to produce other intermediate inputs or final goods is really important. So the fact that businesses can obtain the highest quality, lowest cost inputs is very important to productivity growth in the United States. So the sources of gains come from increased variety, increased productivity, and specialization according to comparative advantage. When we're open to trade, we get to do what we're really good at. Okay, and we let other countries do what they're very good at. And in this town, we are sympathetic to that when it's about exporters and exports. Exporters are good. Over the last 20 years, this has been kind of hammered in that exporters are bigger, they're better, they pay better wages, they're more productive, they're more likely to survive. So there's a sense that exporting is good, but that importing is bad. What's not mentioned is that if we look at importers, the firms that import, they have all the same desirable characteristics as exporters. And it's important because the importers are the exporters. Okay, and it's this ability to import the best inputs from places that do certain things better than we do, combine them in ways that we know how to do uniquely, and then export them. That is a true source of increased living standards in the United States. So I think that's setting the stage a little bit for what these benefits of trade can be. Disrupting those channels can be detrimental. So the benefits are large. I think as we turn to thinking about employment, the benefits have not been equally shared across the society, and I think we'll get to that when we talk about employment.
Yeah, I'd like to, just as a preface maybe to what Dan says, I want to quote from a comment by Adam Posen, the head of the Peterson Institute, who in a report, a special report of the Peterson on the effects of the likely effects of a Trump trade policy, said the amount of dislocation for individuals in an advanced economy like the U.S. caused by trade agreements is significant for those individuals and their communities, but limited in scale. The gains to all other trading democracies have done better by their workers on this score. So I don't know whether, Dan, that helps you pick up or not, but I hope so.
Bob, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming out today. Yeah, the timing of this event is very good. And on the campaign trail, trade and jobs was very much an issue. A lot of talk about winners and losers. I'm a longtime proponent of free trade, and I'll freely acknowledge up front there are losers from free trade, from expanding trade, having increased import competition in our economy. In an important sense, that's the purpose of trade, is to do less of what we're less competitive at and do more of what we're better at. And that means some areas of the economy, some sectors need to shrink while others expand. We make fewer shoes and T-shirts, and we make more jet engines and pharmaceuticals and sophisticated medical equipment, and that involves a certain churn in the labor market. But here's a key point to remember. In a healthy economy, that churn is a good thing. You know, we all focus on the net increase or decrease in jobs each month, but that's a tip of the iceberg. In a typical month in the United States, there are 1 million or more jobs that disappear, replaced by a significant number that's slightly more, and you get that job increase. In fact, the best studies show that about 97% of job displacement in the U.S. economy is not from trade. It's from other factors. Technology is the big disruptor, but changing consumer tastes, internal competition. So when we look at those people displaced by trade, and they're there, that is a slice, a sliver of the displacement going on in the labor market from trade. The biggest displacer in manufacturing isn't trade, it's technology. What is the single biggest reason why we employ 12 million people in manufacturing today compared to about 20 million at its peak in 1979? It's not because of trade agreements, it's not because of imports, it's because of technology. And I can confidently say that because manufacturing output is up significantly. Yes, it goes up and down, it's very cyclical, but over time, we're manufacturing more than we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Different stuff, right? Less consumer goods, more sophisticated things, capital machinery. There was a recent study from Ball State University, which I'd urge you all to Google. They looked at the period from 2000 to 2010 about. We had a decline of 5.6 million manufacturing jobs during that time. they determined that 85% of those jobs were eliminated by technology, by robots, by fewer workers being able to produce more goods. Isn't that the essence of technological progress? But that does mean some people are displaced. There's another well-known study, the China Shock study by David Autor and his co-authors, and they found over, I think, even a longer period, more than a decade, close to 1 million jobs displaced by imports from China. And I don't dispute that. But one, that's over more than 10 years, so fewer than 100,000 people displaced per year by imports from China. How does that compare to this overall job churn? Keep in mind, in a typical week in America, even when the economy is going relatively well, we've got 250 or 300,000 people lining up for unemployment insurance. There's a story behind every one of those people. But the China Shock was responsible, in the course of a year, the China Shock was responsible for about 2 days worth of unemployment. Not to minimize that, but here's the point I'll end on. And Bob pointed to this. Can we do more to help people transition who lose their jobs from manufacturing because of import competition? Or how about the other 97% who've lost their jobs for other reasons through no fault of their own? I think what we need to do is stop beating up on trade as some sort of unique cause of job churn. One, that churn isn't bad. It's good for us, our overall economy. But for every one person who's displaced by trade, there's 25 or 30 who have been displaced because of technology. I'm a refugee from the newspaper business. Employment in newspapers is half of what it was when I left the business in the 1990s. Not because of imported newspapers from China, it's because of technology. What do you do to help people? And we could have another panel discussion on that, but very quickly, better education, not just K through 12, but community college and other things, helping people. Everybody doesn't have to have a PhD in computer science, but how about an associate's degree to help people prepare for the jobs of today and tomorrow, and not somehow bringing back the jobs of the past. More labor market flexibility, portability of benefits, health insurance, retirement savings, retraining for people who are displaced. These are the things we should be doing, not raising trade barriers. Thank you.
Dan, I'd like to ask you, you've been clear about the effects of trade on employment and the role of technology. Is globalization as evil a word? Can globalization be blamed for the technological shifts that we've encountered? And isn't, in a way, aren't the trade folks who are so concerned about this also concerned about damping globalization? Or are they? I don't want to.
Yeah, and of course, globalization is free trade in all its facets, kind of writ large. So globalization in its own way is responsible for this sliver of the job displacement, but you bring up technology. Yeah, globalization and technology go together. Technology facilitates globalization. Globalization brings new ideas and technology to the workplace here in the United States and around the world. I think if people argue against trade as a force for progress, you could make those same arguments against technology. And where does that put us? I say we don't try to put the brakes on technology and say let's have a 5-year timeout on new technology so that people can adjust. We let technology go forward and we help people adjust to that new reality. I would make the same argument for trade.
Thanks a lot. That's helpful. Doug, why isn't the message getting through? I mean, there are a lot of people who think that it's a good thing to have globalization and technology and job change are constructive. Overwhelmingly, it seems people don't buy it.
I'm not sure I have the answer to that question.
We'll give it a shot.
But I guess I would just say that I think this concern about trade agreements is just sort of embedded in the political narrative, and it has been since I've been covering trade, which is 16 20 years. It's you particularly hear it a lot from politicians in the Midwest. You hear it from Ohio and Michigan politicians, and ever since I've been covering trade, I've heard Sherrod Brown and Marcy Kaptur talk about what a bad trade agreement NAFTA was, and in the 2008 political campaign, both President and then candidate Obama and Hillary Clinton talked about how they needed to renegotiate NAFTA to make it a better agreement. So and those arguments are primarily, I think, being made in the industrial Midwest, and because I don't think they resonate quite as much outside of that area. But I think in that part of the country they resonate very very strongly. So you have an electorate that's been told for years that trade agreements are bad, and they're primed to believe it. And this time, instead of having a typical election in which the Republican is defending trade agreements and the Democrat is saying, I'm going to make them better, or I'm going to be somehow responsive to your concerns. You had the Republican outflank the Democrat and say that I'm going to get rid of these agreements, and you had an audience there that was ready to believe it and ready to back him on that. I get the point about. Ambassador Froman says a lot. That people don't get to vote on technology. They only get to vote on trade agreements. And I think that's kind of part of the problem. Technological change, it does cause a lot of job displacement. I think Dan is right. It probably causes more job displacement than trade agreements or trade does. But trade agreements are a government policy, and so people feel strongly about government policies that they feel, incorrectly or not, are endangering their livelihood. So it's not completely the same. I don't think it's completely analogous.
Brad, do you want to comment?
Just to pick up on Doug's point about the politics of it. So the manufacturing sector is what most people think of as what's tradable. However, a lot of people don't realize that there are a lot of service activities that are tradable. Services trade is now 30% of U.S. exports. And the stuff that we have comparative advantage in the United States is high skill, high wage service activities. So think software, think financial services, think architecture, engineering, R&D, those types of activities, what I'll call business services, those are increasingly tradable and a growing part of the U.S. exports. The U.S. runs a trade surplus in services. Okay, so there are lots of people who benefit from services trade. And just to put it in context, business services, what I said, that sounds like a small part of the economy. Let's remember that at this point, manufacturing is less than 10% of employment in the United States. Business services of the type that I just described are 25% of the labor force in the United States. So almost 3 times the size of the manufacturing sector. Okay, and these people are beneficiaries of an open trading system. When we export software, when we export financial services, when we export engineering services, these are all, or Hollywood films, or games, electronic games, all these things, this is what we do well. But back to the political issue, the problem is that workers in these tradable business services are highly concentrated on the coasts, not swing states. Swing states of the type that Doug mentioned, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, all have a disproportionate share of manufacturing workers, and particularly low-wage manufacturing workers, who are very exposed to this type of trade. So the combination of the Electoral College and the fact that it's these heavily former, or still manufacturing dependent states that are swing states amplifies this to a degree in presidential elections that we don't observe in other times. Because in other times, the beneficiaries of trade, the direct beneficiaries, the industries that export and do well by exporting, are more part of the process in non-presidential election years. So I think, if there's any hope, there's some hope in that once the presidential election is over, these other interests can become more prominent in the discussion.
Thanks. Okay, I'd like to turn the discussion to trade agreements, the centerpiece of which is clearly and obviously the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and ask Wendy Cutler for comment on the TPP, its prospects, what are the implications for the United States if the U.S. if the agreement doesn't go forward? How would Asia react? Will our partners go ahead without us? And what is the impact if the U.S. doesn't go forward on other negotiations that are underway, like the TTIP, the TISA, and the China bid? So that's a lot, but I'm going to let Wendy handle that, play with it as she wishes.
Well, thanks. I don't know if I can remember all those questions.
Here, right there, right here.
First, let me just thank you for inviting me here today, and I think the turnout shows how important these issues are and the great interest in these issues.
Wendy, you might want to pull that a little closer.
Okay.
Good.
I'm very impressed with the turnout. I'm also grateful as an alumni of Georgetown University to be on this panel. And I'm also glad that Doug Palmer's on the panel because he's someone who, throughout my career, has always asked me the really tough questions. So now that he's on the panel, I don't think he can, but we'll see.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah. Okay, so TPP, what's going on and, where do we go from here? Let me start by saying I think if you read the press for the past 24 hours, you read the results from the elections, you read what the president-elect has said on the campaign trail and what people around him are saying now, I think it's abundantly clear that it's hard to see a path forward on TPP in the lame duck session. Now, some people are declaring that not only is it dead for the lame duck session, but it's just dead. I take issue with that, and let me explain why. I do recognize that there's a lot of opposition to TPP. This was a front and center issue in the presidential campaign. I mean, I saw the signs on the floor against TPP during the conventions. But I would hope that it would be reconsidered by the administration. I'm not naive. I don't think it's going to happen right away, but I do think that early on in the administration, I hope that it's reconsidered. This was an incredibly long and tough negotiation. It took over 5 years to complete. It was never the administration's plan to conclude it right when the presidential campaign was taking off. I mean, in retrospect, it would have been nice if we'd concluded it earlier. It wasn't a choice because we wanted to come home with a really good deal that we thought that we could defend and that was in the U.S. national economic and strategic interest. So that's kind of what happened. I think Doug did a good job in kind of summing up how this kind of played out during the campaign. It was unprecedented that you had both candidates against trade and against TPP, and their statements just became kind of stronger and more visceral against these issues as the campaign transpired. I would hope, but I would say that I don't think there was a lot of discussion on TPP itself and what's in TPP. It was more about trade and jobs, and TPP kind of became the symbol of that. So I don't think that people were really talking about what was in the agreement and what was wrong and, you know, what needed to be, you know, changed or improved. And so I would hope that the new U.S. trade representative, whoever that is, would be open to learning the facts of the deal, what it actually accomplishes, and I would argue it accomplishes a lot, and the administration achieved the overwhelming majority of its priorities in this agreement, and also would consider kind of the economic rationale and the strategic implications of this deal. I also think the deal is not dead because there are many in Congress who still support free trade and support this deal, including some in important positions of leadership. I think the business community, which supports this deal, are going to make their views known. There are important provisions in this deal, for example, with respect to digital trade or to state-owned enterprises, where there are no rules in trade right now, and countries can do basically whatever they want. And so I think that the businesses will be vocal on this issue going forward. And also in the agricultural sector, where this agreement does a lot to open up opportunities for our farmers and ranchers. Also, our trading partners are not going to let us forget this issue. And here I would just share a story that early on in the Obama administration, I had negotiated the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement during the Bush administration and worked during the Obama administration during that transition. And the candidate Obama came out strongly against the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And in the beginning of the transition, we undertook a review of the deal. And every time that President Obama would meet with the president, at that time, President Lee, this issue would be raised. This was a really important issue for Korea, and President Obama needed Korea's help on a number of other issues. And so I suspect also in TPP, what you're going to find, these 11 other trading partners, Japan, Vietnam, others, are going to be raising this issue, if they haven't already, with the president-elect and his team as he puts it together. Then, Bob had asked the question, well, what happens if we don't do it? What's the rest of Asia doing? In my role now with the Asia Society Policy Institute, I'm just back from Asia last week, back from China and Japan, do a lot of travel to Asia, have a lot of contacts in Asia. And it's very clear that while our TPP partners want to do this deal and have done a lot of heavy lifting for this deal, they're looking at other options as well. And so there are a number of initiatives in the region underway now. Let me just start with a few and then talk a little more about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But for example, just last month, Canada and China announced exploratory talks about a free trade agreement. Australia and Indonesia are finalizing a free trade agreement. And there's something in the press today about how Mexico now is going to be looking towards Asia instead of the United States as kind of their plan B with respect to trade. And then we have these RCEP negotiations, which a number of people in the press has portrayed as the rival negotiation to TPP. I don't think they're rivals, but what is clear is that U.S. is not part of the RCEP negotiations. This is a negotiation among 16 Asian countries. I don't think I can list all 16. I'm going to start the 10 ASEAN countries, plus Japan, Korea, China, India, New Zealand, and Australia. Now, this negotiation has been underway for about 4 years. The trade ministers just met this past weekend in the Philippines, and I urge you to read the statement coming out of their meetings in Cebu. And what they say is that they're working towards swift conclusion. They announce, I think, for the first time that they've concluded one chapter in these negotiations. And there are also discussions about how they're going to kind of move forward, what their negotiating plan is, and they'll have another meeting in Indonesia at the end of the year. Now, this deal is not going to result in high standards like the TPP. It will include services, tariffs, investment, and other issues. but it by definition won't include the United States, and that means by definition the United States will not receive the benefits of this deal. Let me then quickly turn to China. And, China may be viewing all of this. I would say that when TPP was first concluded, and I did go to China, there was a lot of interest about TPP in China. People were reading the text, people were trying to understand what was in it and what it would mean for China, and also what it might take in the future. As China looked at the deal, could it ever join? I think right now, as everyone's preparing to go to the APEC meetings in Peru, China will be pushing its initiative, which used to be the U.S. initiative in APEC, the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. And China's view is that this is kind of the regional negotiation that should be looked at seriously and should be launched. And so we'll have to see how all of this plays out. At this point, maybe I'll just stop. I don't know what the other questions were.
The other question was about impact on other...
On the impact on other negotiations. And, this is a really good question. I think one thing as a trade negotiator, what you learn through the years is that you need to be trustworthy and you need to be credible. And people want to have that confidence that what you negotiate, you're really able to deliver. Now, of course, they understand our system, and they understand these deals have to go to Congress, and they understand us. They've worked with us for a while. But it's that credibility that's really important. And I wonder, I know we're pushing other negotiations and want to conclude a number, including the trade TISA with respect to that's going on in Geneva with respect to services. And I understand those negotiations are very intense now. I don't know how they'll, turn out. I would hope that a good deal could be achieved that would achieve the U.S. objectives. But I do wonder if you're one of our trading partners right now and you're sitting at the negotiating table with us, I have to suspect that part of you is really questioning, can we really deliver? And are we a credible trading partner? And that's an awful position to be in.
Thank you. Okay. Why don't we? Okay. This morning on NPR's Morning Edition, Mara Liasson said there is no question that the U.S. is moving toward protectionism, away from free trade. And so I'm asking all the panelists to opine whether there's a silver lining here. What's the best that could come out of this change in leadership? Anyone want to try with that? Dan.
It's hard to see a silver lining in the election. I think the big question is, I think there's no question that our 70-year bipartisan policy of the United States increasingly engaging and leading in the global economy has come to a screeching halt. We aren't going to be negotiating any ambitious agreements anytime soon. The agreements we have negotiated are in jeopardy. We were a protectionist country in the 1930s that didn't turn out too well. And we turned away from inward-looking protectionism, America first kind of policies after World War II. We were original members of the GATT, and then 30 years ago we started negotiating regional and bilateral agreements, and I think we've reaped a lot of benefits from that, not just economic, but in terms of creating a more congenial world to American values, especially among the Western powers. I think that has come to a halt. The big question is, are we going to have a significant retreat? One of the maddening things about candidate Trump is he was very critical of trade agreements, using hyperbolic language like NAFTA being a disaster, the Trans-Pacific Partnership being the rape of the United States. That was his very intentional choice of words. Are we going to tear up these agreements? What are the consequences of that? He hasn't said what's wrong with the agreements or what he's going to change. If we withdraw from NAFTA, we're withdrawing from an agreement that has achieved 0 tariffs on all trade among the three partner countries. If we revert to what was before, our tariffs were already rock bottom low on imports from Mexico. The Mexican tariffs, especially against agricultural goods, are high if you're not part of NAFTA. So what withdrawing from these agreements or walking away from them does, it basically ensures that the trade barriers our exporters face will be higher than the barriers of imports coming into the United States. We have something of a tradition, and Doug mentioned this, of candidates running more protectionist, and once they get into the Oval Office, they realize, or probably knew all along, that trade was the right policy. The wild card with, I don't think President Obama believed the protectionist stuff he said in 2008. I think Donald Trump really does. It's been a pretty consistent message of his. How is he going to tweak NAFTA or TPP to make them acceptable? It's hard to see.
Thanks. Wendy, I think you have some thoughts about this. That one, yeah, that one works.
Well, just a couple of thoughts. First of all, I just wanted to make a distinction. When people talk about protectionism, I want to make a distinction with the word enforcement. And both candidates were talking a lot about how we needed to really strengthen our enforcement agenda, meaning put a lot of resources into making sure other countries live up to their obligations under their trade agreements, and also using our trade laws to enforce, our rights. And so I personally believe, I've seen the enforcement part of the U.S. trade agenda strengthen over recent years, and I personally think it's a really good idea to strengthen it more. I think that will help build consensus for a trade agenda going forward, because I think there is a perception that we keep negotiating, and we don't spend as much time on the follow-through and making sure that countries live up to their obligations. And enforcement you can do within the rules of the global trading system. You're not breaking them, okay? It's okay. It's okay to use them. When you get to protectionism, I mean, the distinction I make in my mind is really that's what you do that really goes against the rules and really puts up barriers. And here, in that category, I would put, two ideas that candidate Trump put on the table during the campaign season, and that is increasing tariffs, raising tariffs against all Chinese imports. I got to remember what was the 45 and what was the 35, maybe 40.
China 45, Mexico 35.
China 45, Mexico 35. To me, that's protectionism, okay? Because we're violating our trade obligations. We're putting up barriers. And basically, we're shooting ourselves in the foot, because I can tell you, having worked with many countries, one could argue, well, if we increase our trade tariffs against our WTO obligations, then a country will take us to dispute settlement in the WTO, and maybe 2 years later they'll retaliate. No one's waiting 2 years for that. I think we should expect, if we do something like that, very swift and proportional response. And then quickly, this whole system unravels. And the world is so interconnected now, and there's all these global value chains, and our companies are getting, parts from overseas that they put into their products, and then they sell elsewhere. And it's you talk about shooting yourselves in the foot. I think you would really see immediate repercussions on our manufacturing sector as well as other sectors. And a real, immediate effect on, macroeconomic effects as well. So I am concerned about that. I would hope that a Trump administration would, before it does something like this, if it's really considering of doing something like this, would really think through the consequences and the costs. And I think here our business community and other segments of our population, would be pretty vocal about this. Finally, though, with respect to the silver lining, I think there is one. Bob had sent me this question last night. I've been up all night thinking about that. And I think this gets to something that Dan said and he opened up with, and that is, You know, we're kind of at the end of the era of the 60, 70-year trade liberalization policy that has, you know, served us well and the one that we've followed. I would add it's really more the formal end. I mean, we all saw this coming. But I wonder if during this administration, if we work through some of these issues and if we do appropriate, if we implement appropriate domestic policies, some that Dan had mentioned, if maybe we can really rebuild that consensus for trade. So going forward, maybe we don't negotiate as many agreements, but we have, you know, a population that feels that these trade agreements are serving them well and that trade overall, you know, is in our national interest.
Okay, Doug?
I guess the silver lining I see is sort of just from a personal point of view, which is as a reporter, there's going to be a lot to write about. Just seeing how Trump sort of maneuvers on trade, how he sort of, I think, runs into a lot of the realities that the panelists have spoken about. You know, it's easy to demagogue trade when you're out on the campaign trail, but when it gets to actually tearing up the NAFTA agreement and there are companies who have commercial interests at stake, I assume that they're going to speak pretty loudly and, you know, help put the brakes on some of his initiatives. So it'll just be interesting to see how he sort of navigates that. I mean, he's really raised expectations about what he's going to be able to do. And I'll just be interested to see how much he can really accomplish.
All right, some questions. Okay, 1, 2. Go for there. You were first.
Hi, Brian Bradley with International Trade Today. I just saw that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, according to Canadian media, said he's ready to renegotiate NAFTA.
He what?
He's ready to renegotiate NAFTA with President-elect Trump. So basically, my question is, how would Trump go about that? Can he do it by himself? Would he have to get congressional approval? And what would the sectoral implications be for such a withdrawal? And would Mexico be able to renegotiate, or could the U.S. and Canada do it alone?
Anybody want to opine on that?
Well, I thought TPP was meant to be a renegotiation of NAFTA and an update of NAFTA and an enhancing of NAFTA. That was all part of the deal. I think it is unnerving to, you know, that TPP was disparaged without any real content. As I think it was Wendy who said, you know, what would be improved? You know, so what would be the goal of renegotiating NAFTA? It's not clear that renegotiating with Canada would bring jobs back. It's not clear that reopening NAFTA with Mexico would bring jobs back. You know, yes, undoubtedly, manufacturing sector jobs from the United States industrial heartland did move to Mexico. I don't doubt that that's true. The question is, if you renegotiated NAFTA and took away the preferential access of Mexico to the United States, would the jobs move back to the United States or would they move somewhere else? And then would we raise tariffs against everyone else? And then what would be the response in other countries? I think you know, it's not clear, like, what's the ask, right? So I've heard it said, not directly, but secondhand from people who have been on panels with some of Trump's advisors, and they've said that, well, we really don't believe we're going to put 45% tariffs on. This is just kind of an opening bid. Okay, but what's the ask? Is the ask, oh, to send back all those T-shirt and toy and tennis shoe jobs? Is that the ask? It's not clear what the objective is. I think I could propose one. You know, I would propose that, you know, if you're going to reopen this to you know, with China, if you're going to play hardball, try to open up the service sector. It's an area where we have very pronounced comparative advantage against China, where we have unilaterally liberalized. The United States has very low barriers to services trade relative to the rest of the world. China's are relatively high. So that, you know, this is a very generous interpretation, but you could say that there would be a legitimate ask. But it's not clear to me, you know, what Trump would hope to accomplish by renegotiating NAFTA with Canada.
And I would just add, if the hope was that, like, we would raise our tariffs, but you know, we would reimpose our tariffs, but they wouldn't. I mean, you can be like the best negotiator in the world. I don't think you're going to succeed with that. And just to build on something, you know, that you had mentioned is that TPP really updated NAFTA, and you know, when you look through the various chapters and what Canada and Mexico did beyond NAFTA, you look at an intellectual property, digital trade, state-owned enterprises, even, you know, the customs area, et cetera. All throughout this, there was an updating of NAFTA and frankly, a renegotiation of NAFTA. So I'm also kind of at a loss. What are we asking for when we get back to the table with them? And once again, if it's an unbalanced tariff deal, I think that negotiation is going to be over pretty quickly, and it's not going to be successful.
Brad makes an interesting point. I hadn't thought of it. Under the threat of drastic U.S. action, like a 40% tariff and like totally disrupting trade with China, by the way, China needs our trade, maybe we use that as an occasion to increase our negotiated advantage with the Chinese. Maybe that could be somehow at the end of the day constructive. Anyway, that's my effort as silver lining. Let's go there.
So, on Brett Fordham from Inside U.S. Trade.
Speak up, okay?
Brett Fortnum from Inside U.S. Trade. Does Trump's election give the current administration more impetus to try and conclude TISA, which, you know, appears to be the only trade deal that could be concluded with this administration? And will that change the current ambition of the deal? And my understanding is the administration is operating under the assumption that TISA would not need congressional approval. I mean, is it even conceivable for that deal to be completed and then implemented before Trump takes the oath of office?
Maybe.
Someone else answer that.
What's that?
Someone else, yeah.
Okay, well, I think,
Why don't you answer?
why don't I answer that? Oh,
Yeah.
What do I know? There are lots of problems with I mean, it's not just about our negotiating credibility. I think Wendy has made a very good point. If you were a bunch of negotiators sitting around the table in Geneva today looking at TISA, you'd be looking at the United States representative and saying, you know, are you credible? Secondly, with TISA, we're nowhere near a deal as far as I can understand it. The Europeans have refused to extend to us the benefits that Canada got under CETA. They want extra payment. The TPP levels of access that we agreed to in TPP aren't good enough. They want more than that. They have member states who are all upset that the Commission hasn't been aggressive enough with the United States. So, and on data flows, they're nowhere. I mean, they are immobilized. And the Commission had to confess or admit recently in Oslo that this agreement, the TISA, because it covers multiple sectors, it's therefore a mixed agreement. The European Union has the power constitutionally only to implement part of it. The rest of it has to go to the member states. Well, look what happened when they went to the guys in Wallonia. So there are lots of questions out there about TISA, and it isn't just about this change in administration. The essence of it is that it's not, as I understand it, I'm going to go to a meeting this afternoon of the ITAC, the Trade Policy Committee, Advisory Committee, and maybe I'll find out. But as I understand it, we're yeah, there's a lot of intensity, and there's been some, I think, overripe ambition expressed by some of our leading trade officials, including Ambassador Punk, but they don't seem to have been followed up or substantiated by action on the ground. Okay. Back there, Sherry.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate this panel, and
Can't hear.
thank you for the panel. Excellent insights. This Sherry Stevenson, ICTSD. I think historically I'm correct that I think one of the tragedies of this election, or sad, many of the sad aspects, is that prior to the start of the presidential campaign, the U.S. population actually had finally, and on a majority, I think more than 50% indicated that it was finally in favor of free trade, that actually it had come around to a more favorable stance towards trade, which hadn't been the case at all under in the early years of the Obama administration. And I thought that was actually great. But then now, after the presidential campaign and both parties, and negative attitude, we've really gone backwards light years in that respect. So, how do we go about rebuilding a favorable attitude and consensus towards trade if the people leading us will not express that opinion? And one quick question to Wendy in this regard. In APEC, the FTAAP, Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, that APEC wants to launch next year in terms of actual negotiations, this is the only venue in which the U.S. and China are actually negotiating together. Someone mentioned that would be very useful. But the U.S., my understanding is, doesn't really want to move forward on this. So what are the prospects there, and why not?
Well, let me just answer that question. First, it's not true that APEC wants to launch an FTAP next year. What's going on in APEC is that there's a collective strategic study that was launched 2 years ago during China's host year in APEC. That study is to be delivered to leaders this year. The U.S. and China are leading the study, meaning they're working with the other 19 APEC economies to conclude this study. And my understanding is they're working out, under China and U.S. leadership, they're working out their differences with respect to what recommendations should come out of this study. I just want to make one comment on the TISA question that was asked earlier, and that is, I worked many years for many different USTRs, U.S. Trade Representatives, I think 9 altogether. And we'd always get these questions towards the end of an administration. Are you rushing, to do a deal before the next administration, and that means you're going to take, a weaker deal? And I can tell you with full confidence that no one at USTR and no USTRs are going to come home with a weak deal just to conclude a deal before a change in administration. There are standards, there are criteria that are used before a deal is concluded, and I have full confidence that under Ambassador Froman's and Ambassador Punk's leadership, that if TISA is concluded, it will be a good deal that serves our national interests.
Dan.
Sherry, thanks for asking about the politics. And I know there's people in the room who work for members of Congress, and of course you're interested in the substance and the politics. I'd say let's not panic. I think what we've had in this election is a failure of leadership at the top. I'm not a pollster, but if you look at polls on trade over time, they are fairly consistent. There's a kind of a working majority of Americans who are comfortable enough with trade to see it move forward with certain qualifications. You take care of the losers, that sort of thing. And I almost hate to admit this, but trade is almost never the top issue for a lot of voters. It's issue number 6 or 7. It rarely determines the outcome of elections. We're talking about Ohio, and yes, you get some protectionist sentiment in Ohio, and Doug mentioned Sherrod Brown and Marcy Kaptur, but that's also the home state of Rob Portman and John Kasich. Governor Kasich had a wonderful op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago about why TPP was a great agreement. He's very popular in Ohio. I think for my conservative Republican friends, Ronald Reagan was able to appeal to the blue-collar voters without selling out on protectionism because he knew it was wrong and it wasn't politically necessary. So I think there is political space for leaders in both parties, center-right, center-left. No, maybe not the Bernie Sanders left no, not the Breitbart News right, but the traditional center left and center right to move ahead on trade policy. But for reasons I mentioned, I think a President Trump is going to be very problematic in terms of moving forward. The challenge is to limit the backsliding in the next year or two.
I want to comment, if I may. I'm sorry, Dan, I'll come to you in a minute. You know, lots of us have heard this story repeatedly. I go back far enough to the Nixon administration, when Nixon ran against textile imports. And the big deal was whether we would tighten down on textile imports and have a multilateral textile trade agreement. And he appointed a USTR, a very weak USTR, and it was clear that that we were going to, and we did. Not as drastically as he proposed, but we did tighten that, and not to our nation's benefit, I might add. But there was a moderation in the implementation. Clinton, what did he do? He had a renegotiation. He had a couple of memoranda of understanding, some letters, and oh gosh, NAFTA was okay with these qualifications. Regrettably, NAFTA has taken it on the chin repeatedly, even though it doesn't deserve it, and the data don't show that it's a bad agreement. Clinton went ahead. Obama the same, and now we have, in a much exaggerated form, we have Mr. Trump, who has raised the stakes, and his wannabe economist, Mr. Navarro, was on the radio yesterday with Diane Rehm show, and he said, you know, he said, look, this is what we want to do, and but give the president a chance. Don't just throw these campaign shibboleths, these things back that he wants to do 45% and 35%. Just give him a chance. Give him a break. It's not going to be as bad as that. Now, if I were Diane Rehm, I would have said, what do you mean? He was not telling the truth. He didn't really mean all the stuff he said. She didn't say that. But that's the implication. And so maybe don't want to minimize this problem, but you know, maybe in fact, as somebody suggested, the bite won't be as bad as the bark. Question. Oh, Dan, you were first. Sorry, I'll come to you. I will.
Dan Pearson with the Cato Institute. My compliments to all panelists for truly thoughtful comments. Just for what it's worth, on Monday the 14th, this coming, at Cato, we have former USTRs Cantor and Schwab. I've asked them to give their thoughts on what the United States might have to do to start once again moving forward toward trade liberalization. Should be an interesting conversation.
Are you prepared to pay a fee for that advertisement?
Pardon?
Are you prepared to pay a fee for that advertisement?
No, I'm not. But lunch is provided there too. See, so
okay.
But
that's
no, but I did actually have a question. It has to do with.
Okay.
It was a two-part thing. Yeah. So the Tariff Proclamation Authority. At times, the president has authority to change tariffs without Congress coming in and granting additional authority. Does anyone know? Does he currently possess such authority? And if so, would it allow him to raise tariffs or only to reduce them? Wendy, you. Yeah. So, I mean, my operating assumption has been that Congress would actually have to vote to raise the tariff on the Mexican stuff to 35%. And if anyone knows that for sure, please fill me in.
I don't have the answer, but our colleague Gary Huffbauer at the Peterson Institute wrote a wonderful paper, and Gary's not only a PhD economist but a lawyer, on the considerable authority that a U.S. president has to manipulate trade policy going back to World War I statutes on emergency powers.
Nixon imposed a surcharge.
It's not just the Tariff Proclamation Authority, but there are other laws that would allow a president under certain circumstances to raise tariffs.
Correct.
Do temporary types of,
well, just like Nixon did.
And by the time the court challenges and WTO challenges ran their course, the 45% tariffs would have done their damage and invited retaliation.
Okay, right there.
Hi, I'm Anna Kliss. I'm a professor of economics at Northern Illinois University, which is out in rural Illinois. And so I'm going to ask a bit of a paradigm shift of you. If we're thinking about a trade zone with no tariffs and very easy costs, we are one. We're 50 states. And so since we're doing so well in business services, I wanted to ask, why are those all on the coasts? Now, so I know that some of the answers may be that there is some sort of network effect, that there is the idea of being in a city is somehow, you know, you're near everybody else that needs to be. And yet I would say that Austin, Texas is clearly pulling a lot of other tech jobs. So there's this clear idea that you could have, with the rise of technology, if it's not globalization that is ruining manufacturing jobs, but technology, why is technology then not bringing in more remote conference calls? Why are there not more services out in the middle of the country where there are certainly educated people, where educated people could move? There are low costs of living. I mean, if you're thinking about what Google has done to San Francisco, you know, there's low-cost housing everywhere else in the country, pretty much, and you know, grocery shopping bills are very tiny. So then, what is the reason? Why have we not seen free trade within our own country in that sort of a case?
The single most expert person in the world to answer that is right here, Dr. Jensen.
So when you look at the U.S., I oversimplified when I said it was the coasts. It's not the coast. Chicago is a big concentration of tradable business service activity. Minneapolis has one. Denver has one. So you do see big concentrations of business service activity off the coasts. It's not just the coasts. But it doesn't tend to be in swing states. And that's the point. So with two colleagues, I should mention my two colleagues, Dennis Quinn and Steve Weymouth, we have a paper where we look at county level industrial structure and county level voting in presidential elections. And we see that there is this strong relationship where people, counties that have more tradable business service jobs tend to vote for the incumbent, which we interpret as being pro-free trade, whereas counties with lots of low-wage manufacturing workers tend to vote against the incumbent. And again, this ties to this notion that incumbents tend to be more free trade. No matter what they say on the campaign trail, once they become president, they become more free trade. And we think that there's this electoral college mechanism to make presidential candidates less free trade oriented because of the concentration of these potentially either displaced or potentially displaced manufacturing workers in places like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So it's very much an electoral college and swing state. And I don't know if there's a deeper economic reason why the swing states have those concentrations or whether it's just bad luck.
Okay, there's a problem here. You've had your hand up and I've ignored you. Jean-Francois has as well, and you have, then you have. So can you make it quick? Actually, there's no rush of time. So.
I'm Wencheng Huang from Taiwan. I'm a trade diplomat. One question. If we go back to 1994, I think a lot of people know that, we changed the title of Trans-Pacific Partnership to some kind of close Pacific Partnership, just like they did from multilateral trade organization to World Trade Organization. Is it possible politically could be accepted by the President and the Congress?
To do what exactly?
Rebrand.
You change the name and then the president-elect supports the deal?
Well, any port in a storm.
You know, maybe one thing we could do, you know, on currency manipulation, maybe that's something that Mr. Trump would insist come into trade agreements. You know, when he landed in Scotland in June, it was the day after the Brexit vote, and, you know, the pound plunged by 15%. And Mr. Trump actually observed that that would be good for his Gulf resort there. Maybe if we could get him to locate some of his hotels in China, he wouldn't be so upset about
he probably is already there. You ought to check. He's probably got. Okay, Jean-Francois.
Thanks. Well, actually, two questions. First one about the TPP and the likelihood that it will ultimately pass. And I feel really bad for Wendy because that is a masterpiece as far as a negotiation can go. You cannot get a better result. She did not give anything. So, but, you know, given the rhetoric of the campaign, and given the fact that so many presidents before have talked pretty bad about their predecessor's job and then switched position 6 months after being in office, do you think that the current president-elect can do that without going back to politics as usual, which would be fairly bad for somebody who wants to drain the swamp, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican swamp? And the second question is about the Western states, because lots of people complain about trade, not about technology, obviously. Do people ever question the fact that many jobs are also lost to competition from certain states who offer subsidies plus non-unions?
Okay, question one. Who wants to comment? Doug?
I don't know. That's the first question about can Trump flip on TPP.
Will the press allow him?
Yeah, I don't know. I was kind of thinking about that. I mean, it certainly would be a big moment if he did. But there is this phenomenon of presidents, candidates being really tough on trade on the campaign trail and then rethinking it when they get into the White House. And other people I've talked to don't rule that out. It seems like it would be a big leap, but I guess it's not an impossibility.
I think it's more difficult for Mr. Trump. He's staked out such a extreme position in our two-party presidential politics. There is evidence he really believes it. That's a position he's had that's fairly consistent going back 20 years. And also, virtually all presidents have been surrounded by the 95% of free trade, of economists who think free trade is good. Mr. Trump has managed to find some of the 5%, like Peter Navarro, who don't agree with that, and he'll probably be very prominent in the administration. So who's he going to listen to, if anybody? If he just listens to himself, he'll probably stay on his own policy. If he listens to Peter Navarro, he probably will as well. So it's a big unknown.
I would just add that he'll face economic challenges and how to grow our economy. He'll face, foreign policy issues that he'll need to work through with other countries. And so, when you look at an issue like trade, that's one issue. But if you look at it, in the context of all the other issues that he's going to need to deal with, it gives me some hope that a way forward can be found.
What was the second part? Intrastate competition for investments. Does anybody want to comment about that?
States within the United States have been poaching employers from other states for a long time. Yeah. I don't doubt that when the textile and apparel factories moved from the Northeast to the Southeast, that there was a hue and cry in the Northeast, but it went on, and there weren't, because of the way the United States is organized, there wasn't the possibility of tariffs between the states. But who knows? If there had been that prospect, maybe there would have been that kind of very destructive policy that would have impeded American growth along the way. So I don't know why, if it's bad to have tariffs between states within the United States, why is it good to have tariffs between countries?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to take the liberty of asking the last question. It's based upon the Peterson Institute's report on the effects of Trump's policies as implemented. They gave three scenarios. It gets completely implemented, it's abandoned, and the third one, I believe, is that it implodes. That it is so drastic, has such a bad effect on employment, such a bad effect on consumer goods, such a bad effect on lower income buyers of things like brooms and plastic pots, that the idea that we can regenerate a workforce attuned to that kind of production is nuts. And it just won't happen. The whole thing will just implode. Dan?
So I'm predicting which of those three scenarios?
No, I'm wondering what you think about implode.
I think it's quite possible if he were to implement his full policy, one, you wouldn't see the positive. You're not going to see some manufacturing renaissance. If 85% of the manufacturing jobs have disappeared because of technology, a tariff on Chinese goods isn't going to restore those jobs. So there's going to be disappointment that the positive promised results haven't occurred, and then you're going to see the knock-on negative effects, including retaliation. You know, we export over $100 billion worth of goods to China every year, and U.S. companies located in China sell another $250 billion in goods and services, very little which comes back to the United States. It's sold in China and on to third countries. You add those two together, you've got $350 billion of U.S. branded goods and services being sold to and through China that are going to be put in jeopardy if Mr. Trump's plan is implemented in full.
Anybody else? Okay, well, join me in thanking this really extraordinary event.